Let me tell you a little bit about how this lecture came into being. This department was founded in the year 1961, which is the year I was born, and is also the year in which John Howes was hired as one of the very first professors in the department as an assistant professor. He still didn't have his PhD yet. He was still a PhD student at Columbia. By 1965, he had finished that PhD, and then a year later was appointed as an associate professor, and if I have my facts right, was promoted to full professor in 1986, and then retired in 1990. So if you do the math, he's been around a little while, and he's still doing great, and he's sitting right here in the front. Could you just sort of give a wave, John? John Howes. John Howes, you know, as I say, was a founding professor of the department and is one of those professors and colleagues that sets a very high bar for the rest of us in terms of the way he interacts and interacted with students. And I know, by the way, I took a quick look at the RSVP list. We had over 200 RSVPs for this evening. That's the most we've ever had for one of these lectures, of whom 50 plus were alumni of the department. And many of those alumni are here because of their relationship with Professor Howes. And when you speak with them about their experiences as students in this department, they will without exception tell you that he was the professor whose door was always open. He was the professor who wrote the crucial letter of recommendation to get the Mombusho, who made the crucial phone call to get that job at the expo in Japan, who opened all these doors to that first life-changing experience that had to do with Japan, and that became essentially a career of involvement with Japan. So all of those students gathered together, pooled their funds along with faculty in the department to create the initial endowment which has made this, this lecture possible, along with fiscal year-end spending down. We're really pleased to be doing this fourth lecture. Without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Sherilyn Orba, and thank you all for coming. I'm really looking forward to the lecture. Sherilyn, it's up to you.
So as Ross just said, my name is Sherilyn Orba, and I teach modern Japanese literature here at the University of British Columbia. And it's my privilege to be able to introduce our speaker tonight. As Ross said, this lecture series is meant to honor Professor Emeritus John Howes, who was such an important and highly regarded contributor to the Asian Studies Department, to UBC, as well as to the academic field of Japanese history. And the lecture series, in a way, honors him by inviting and honoring other scholars who have inspired and supported the Japanese Studies faculty in the department. So when it came my turn to invite someone, I was gratified and delighted to bring Norma Field, Professor Emerita of the University of Chicago. My first encounter with Norma's work came in 1987 when I was still a graduate student, and she published her first book, The Splendor of Longing in the Tale of Genji. At that point, there were not many studies in English of Genji, that monumental work written about 1,000 years ago by Murasaki Shikibu, which made it all the more remarkable that Norma's book did not simply perform some kind of standard literary analysis, but really went directly to the heart of why it was so appealing and popular in its day and through all the centuries since, especially among women readers. Norma took the book, that is Genji Monogatari, seriously and treated its numerous female characters as important personages, worthy of minute attention and analysis, which was certainly the way they were treated in the imaginations of the legions of readers. Her next book, though, was very different. In the Realm of a Dying Emperor, 1991, was not about literature and was not about the past. In it, she explored the Japanese society she saw around her when she was living in Japan in 1988 and 89, as the Showa emperor, also known as Hirohito, was dying. In this book, Norma begins with observations about how the Japanese press was handling the emperor's death and recreating the story of his life. And then she weaves that together with 3 other real-life stories, not fiction, such as the mayor of Nagasaki, who had dared to say that the Showa emperor should bear some responsibility for the war, and thereafter endured daily attacks from the press and from fellow politicians. In 1997, Norma published Sketches from My Grandmother's Bedside, a beautiful and very personal book about her memories of growing up in Tokyo shortly after the end of the war, and also about her observations and impressions of contemporary Tokyo as she cared for her ailing, beloved grandmother. More recently, she's returned to literature, modern literature this time, specifically the writings of proletarian authors active in the 1920s and 30s in Japan. These works are extremely important both literarily and politically, but they've almost never been discussed up to this point, except by Norma and now by her many PhD students who hold academic positions all over North America. And I hope you saw the books in the lobby, which are available for sale. So what holds these very different publications together? Norma believes that the stories we tell ourselves really matter. The events we choose to memorialize in stories matter. It makes no difference whether those stories are fiction written 1,000 years ago or contemporary newspaper accounts of the death of an emperor. The stories we write and read and share with each other shape who we are individually and as a community or a society. Norma's topic tonight continues that personal, political, and passionate trajectory as she examines the stories being constructed around Fukushima. Please join me in welcoming Norma Field.
Well, that's so overwhelming, Sherilyn. Thank you so much. I'm really grateful. I actually have met John Howe many years ago. We served on a committee together, the Inter-University Center, sometimes it was then called the Stanford Center, and I remember feeling very impressed with this person from Canada in a public institution, and someone who would call our attention to that in this, what I will say really was a boys' club of elite private American institutions. And I feel singularly privileged then to be able to celebrate his work, his achievements, his life, to be part of that here, and very grateful to Sherilyn for having brought me here. I've been here almost 30 hours, and it's a wonderful, wonderful community. You are so lucky to have each other. I hope you'll remember that and think of it, you know, because it doesn't happen everywhere or even most places. It makes life so much more bearable in these, you will agree, trying times. So I'm also a bit humbled to think that I'm speaking on Martin Luther King Day in the US and thinking about the Poor People's March that he started up, his view that economic justice was fundamental to everything he and his brothers and sisters wanted for in racial justice. That happens to be also a very strong component of how I think about Fukushima, is that the need for economic justice on so many levels in order to deal with this catastrophe. When I say catastrophe, I'm thinking of a friend telling me a story about a physician in Chernobyl, and after, you know, those explosions and somehow bringing it under control, this doctor said, the accident is over now, the catastrophe begins. So living in the catastrophe, and I think, sadly, that 50 years from now, also, people will need to be talking about Fukushima. But it would be wonderful, the most wonderful thing, if the people living not just in Fukushima, but living the years of Fukushima, and then Chernobyl, too, or 3 Mile Island, not much acknowledged any longer in the United States, could say we haven't seen a single disaster like that since. So that's the hope, the trajectory I bring to you. I hope in the course of this talk to make good on my title, especially the subtitle, 5 long, short years, Our World, Our Fukushima. I'd like to be able to justify the R. It's not so easy, but that's the task. And to begin what I'd like to do is to show you two short clips. So if we could turn the lights down. I'm going to turn that off. I'll talk more about that, but that was taken by a drone. I would say one of the better uses that a drone has been put recently. But just hold your questions about this that I'm sure are occurring to you. And let's watch this also briefly. I think you get the idea. The second one is by, some of you might not have caught it, by someone named Isao Hashimoto, who had been in the finance world for 14 years. He's currently a curator of the Lalique Museum in Hakone, and he's decided to dedicate himself to find ways to share the sense of the folly of nuclear weapons. And I wanted, first of all, without too much explanation, for us to have this experiential, to have the eeriness of it as a shared experience. The eeriness where we don't see human beings in a context in which, of course, thousands of human lives are being impacted, and which also speaks, again, in the terms of the music, or the sound, I won't say music, and the use of the drone, for example, about the whole technological basis for what has happened for this history. But also, having done so, then to think about the ways in which human beings have been impacted, which is more my concern for today. That first film, the one done by a drone, it's the Sendai office of NHK that did it, and it was aired last year, March 11th, so the 4th anniversary, almost 1 year ago. And the writing that was displayed was a part of a survey of people who had left Fukushima, and asking questions such as, what are your ties to your hometown now? How much trust do you have in them? What is your relationship now to old friends? Do you see them much anymore? Do you think of returning? How long did it take you to make up your mind to leave? And the majority said 3 years. So it's interesting to think of that, right? To have that disaster occur, and to have that the fact that it took 3 years to come to this decision, and probably, of course, other people will come to that. And what was their greatest reason for not wanting to come back? And it was sort of the infrastructure, the conditions, the material conditions for life were unsettled, and kind of far down the list was worried about radioactive exposure. Okay, I also was giving the second one, the time-lapse video of all the nuclear explosions. They only go to 1998. By the time this 14-minute film is finished, 1 minute for every year, you will see the flags of the United States, the Soviet Union, the UK, you saw those, China and France, and India. I can't remember if you get to see Pakistan. Of course, others have, we know, and Korea did something recently. We're not everybody's sure what exactly. But a great deal of exploding has happened. I'm sorry, I took Sudafed, so I have to drink a lot of water, or I'll have to stop speaking altogether. Let's see. I wanted not. Well, let's take a look at this. Okay. I just wanted you to quickly see, since we saw kind of the international scale of nuclear explosions, nuclear weapons, the situation of nuclear power plants in North America. And, it says US and Canada, but you hardly see Canada. Most of the Canadian power plants are concentrated in Ontario. And you can see just how concentrated it is in the eastern half of the United States. I believe right now there are 99 that are functioning in the US, and Canada, out of 22, 18 are functioning. I should say that both of these maps would look very, very different if we looked at not just the commercial nuclear power plants, reactors, because there are also research ones that all produce stuff for the military. But if we were to look at uranium deposits and uranium mining, both of these maps would be filled up in quite a different way, filled up more on the western side, and we would also have to be utterly mindful of how many indigenous peoples in both Canada and the United States are impacted by uranium mining. And I don't think, I may not have time to touch on this, but One of the things that I really learned only after Fukushima is the argument of climate change requiring nuclear power, or the many arguments that can be mounted against that, like how long it takes to build a plant, et cetera, how we have still no waste disposal for nuclear power plants, but also the fact that it's not using fossil fuels only when it's producing electricity. Otherwise, from all of the mining, the milling, the transportation, all of that is using the other kinds of fuel that we know have been problematic. And we have to know that every step of the way, someone is being exposed. Many people are being exposed. So it's that kind of resource, that kind of power. Let's also look quickly. This is a familiar map. This is the United States fallout map showing the areas crossed by 2 or more radioactive clouds during the era of nuclear testing, 1951 to 62, in the American Southwest. Well, this doesn't show downwinder damage from the plutonium production plant in Washington State, or indeed a lot of more subtle damages that have never been recognized. But it does give us a sense of the ways in which the plume traveled over and over and over. And I'm not going to show a picture of the Fukushima plume tonight, but we have to think about how many times these radioactive clouds circulate around the Earth, and that they're depositing, precipitating radionuclides into the soil and the water and the air. So and that is a good chance for me to say something very fundamental. How many of you know the difference between external and internal exposure? Couple? A half dozen. Okay, there, yes. In Japanese, it's naibu hibaku, internal, and gaibu hibaku. When people tell you, don't worry about radiation, you're exposed all the time when you take a jet flight, it is true. You are exposed, but that is external, X-rays, so forth and so on. These are not great, by the way. It'd be better not to have that exposure either, but those rays pass through our bodies. Internal exposure occurs when we breathe the air, which has radionuclides in it, particles in it, when we drink water, when we eat things grown in soil. And when we take into our bodies, radionuclides are quite specific. They settle into particular organs, particular parts of the body, and they continue to emit ionizing radiation. I kind of picture it to myself like having internalized a nuclear reactor, so that takes a very long time to get rid of, and in fact, it's virtually not possible, although with a great deal of work, in some cases, it can be helped. I'll get to that later, too. I think I want to show a slide that shows what I take to be the connection between the first two video clips. The phrase, atoms for peace, I think is responsible for having made us cognitively impaired on the nuclear issue. Atoms for peace sounds good. I know from reading early issues of the Bulletin for Atomic Scientists, produced at the University of Chicago. It's the one, do you all know about the doomsday clock? How many minutes before midnight? That's a logo for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And reading the very early issues, you can tell that the atomic scientists are yearning for something good to come out of this. So there is that kind of genuine desire for redemption from this technology they've unleashed. Many of them become very active pacifists or people who believe in world government and meet a sorry fate under McCarthyism. Oppenheimer himself was quite haunted. But in any case, Eisenhower comes along. Now, Eisenhower, a military man, as you know, is a president who thought that the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was not necessary. He's also the one who famously warned the American public about the military-industrial complex. But his views on nuclear weapons changed while he was in office. And he began to think, he was so worried with the Cold War that America was going to be saddled with a military budget that it couldn't climb out from under. let's do the efficient thing, you know, these atomic weapons. And the European allies, Churchill and Belgium, they were appalled at the kind of talk that Eisenhower and his generals were spewing forth. And then, in order to cover up, in order to make the use of atomic weapons more friendly to people, more entertainable, this is the idea that was cooked up, atoms for peace. You know, we were going to give nuclear fuel to X number of countries, and here's the rub. Why not Japan first? Sidney Yates, distinguished senator from Illinois, said that as a Christian nation, we owe it to the Japanese to give them the wherewithal to tap into this remarkable, miraculous energy for the future. So Eisenhower announcing Atoms for Peace in December 1953, and then the Bravo shot on Bikini Atoll, March 1st, 1954. That's the one that's famous, been made famous for the Lucky Dragon, right? The Japanese tuna fishing vessel, contaminated fish being sold in Japan. One thing that's more and more coming out is that Lucky Dragon was hardly the only Japanese boat that was caught in that test, and more we are able to know more and more about other people suffering from that. But Eisenhower et al. Had to work very hard to overcome the skepticism one might have about Atoms for Peace with this bikini test, 4 months later, not even 4 months later. And there's a huge campaign mounted in Japan. The young Nakasone, the owner of the Yomiuri Giants, some of you know this story very well, really, especially in Hiroshima, worked very hard. And I remember as a child growing up in Japan, hearing that how important it was, this was Japanese news, how important it was to get the Japanese people over their nuclear allergy, you know, as if being afraid of nuclear weapons was an allergy, and allergy was something to be ashamed of, like a kind of the taint of backwardness. And it worked. It worked. And that is why Japan came to have 54 active nuclear reactors. It was actually thinking of, I think the overall plan, and it may yet again be, is 50% reliance. Now, under Kan Naoto, the hapless prime minister during March 11th, I think initially he was aiming for 15% reliance, eventually, in other words, reducing the number. But doing this survey of the country, he realized, he and his teammates, the Democratic Party of Japan, realized that really there was a very strong inclination among the Japanese people to go down to nuclear zero. And he declared that, and he promptly was shoved out. There's one more thing I needed to say, I'm sorry, about internal and external exposure. The reason so few of us have known about internal exposure is not accidental, it's not our ignorance. It was a deliberate policy, certainly in the United States. The dangers of internal exposure were known in the early 1940s as the Hanford research reactor was put up in Washington State. And both DuPont and the government said, this is really problematic. Let's not let this cat out of the bag. Because think, if breathing, drinking, and eating, or a cut in your finger are enough for you to internalize these radionuclides, it's going to be very hard to persuade people to work around these materials, to tolerate their testing. And so this has been kept under wraps. And the statistics, what is I think still might be referred to as the gold standard of longitudinal study, i.e. the Hibakusha study of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, still does not include internal exposure. So you can see what a very skewed standard that study is presenting the world today. Now I want to quickly refresh our minds about what happened March 11th. You all remember those very dramatic images of the earthquake first, and especially the tsunami, right? Where buildings float off and boats land where they shouldn't be, and really the trauma that came with that. And then the Fukushima Daiichi explosions. Usually it's told in that story, first earthquake, then tsunami, then the Daiichi, the loss of coolant. But that is also a very important point that's being contested. That is to say, it's been easy for TEPCO to argue that, look, this extraordinary event, once in 1,000 years you get an earthquake of that scale and tsunami of that height. Of course you can understand if the backup reactor generators give out. But in fact, there seems to be some evidence that at least there was partial loss of power already before the tsunami hit. But also very importantly that TEPCO had been told to consider strategies for the tsunami of that height from 7 or 8 years earlier, and decided not to because it cuts into your profit, to prepare for that degree of readiness. This is all will be part of a very important criminal trial that will probably begin this summer, and I will speak more about that, and I hope you'll pay attention to it. I hope it is covered in English. You remember that December 2012, the roadmap was said to have been met, the goals of the roadmap, and Prime Minister Abe went to London in 2013 and said the leakage, the outpouring of tons of radioactively contaminated water had been brought under control. That was a very interesting moment because TEPCO, whom I don't think anyone would accuse of excessive or imprudent honesty, came out the day after Prime Minister's announcement in London, which got Japan the 2020 Olympics, and said, no, we haven't said that we have the radioactive water under control. That was a good moment. Has not had an impact. I mean, the Olympics, I suppose, will go on. Through what? At what cost? There are many, you've seen the hazmat suit images. So today I want to just share some words with you. This is from this booklet, which a graduate school friend and I translated, and it's available very reasonably as an ebook. It's statements compiled of people, not necessarily who are Fukushima natives, but were there in Fukushima at the time that the accident part took place. And the idea was that because the prosecutors seemed to be doing absolutely nothing, the police were doing nothing, that citizens needed to take action. And they do what, there is a term criminal complaint in US law too, but it's a bit different in Japan. It's a citizen's criminal complaint for the asking for investigation and indictment. And in order to make that persuasive, the organizers interviewed people, many reluctant. Many people appear in this booklet anonymously, won't even have their gender or their age disclosed, which tells you, again, something, a very important aspect of how this disaster is working out in Japan. So let me just remind you of kind of the quality of the initial confused, desperate experience. This is a 47-year-old. Somebody in a white hazmat suit got out of a patrol car and told us, go 10 kilometers. Stuck in a huge traffic jam, I began to vomit violently and had to be transported to a hospital while trying to flee. Sounds like acute radiation sickness. 53-year-old, right after the accident, somebody from the fire department made the announcement, if you go out, be sure to take a shower. What was he talking about? Telling us to take a shower when there's no running water because of the earthquake. A persistent refrain, predictably, is about children. And the shock of learning because there was no reliable information coming out. It was 0.6 microsieverts per hour. I won't get into that part of it, the technical measurements per hour at my 3-year-old daughter's bedside. When I saw that reading, I burst into tears. Age withheld, name withheld. Age 63. When the Geiger counter went past 100 microsieverts, I couldn't tell my family. All the strength drained from my body. It's over, I said to myself, and wondered what we could do from then on. 46-year-old, believing the government's announcements that there would be, quote, constantly repeated, no immediate health effects, our family went out every day, struggling to secure food and water. A lot of that happened. And of course, if you were a parent with a young child, you couldn't leave the young child at home. So you stood in line, breathing in that air, for hours and hours and hours to try to secure safe drinking water. On the day of the entrance ceremony, my child stood with her new school bag on her back and a mask on her face, surrounded by radioactivity. What had we done? The thought fills me with bitter regret to this day. So many families that had left rushed back because they got notices from their school district that the new school year was starting. And people have said to themselves afterwards, why did we think we had to respond to that? Why was that an order that we had to obey? 36-year-old, I have lost my work, my restaurant, my home, my money, and my friends. 63-year-old, in a letter form, dear officers of TEPCO, officials of the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, and hired gun scholars. That's what I did for Goyo Gakusha. Would you be upset if you lost your homes? Have you ever thought about your hometowns disappearing? We have lost everything. And then a special kind of torment for some people who've stayed behind, especially school teachers. Not a day goes by without the torment of shame, as well as guilt over the sense that, quote, my continuing to teach here is causing the children to be exposed to radiation. So I couldn't leave for whatever reason. I continue to work at my job, and other people will say to me, you should be ashamed of yourself. You're leading to children being exposed. So there's a lot of that. Disabilities. Now, this is a particularly fraught issue, and I don't know how to deal with it, and I would like to know about your ideas. Having severe disabilities, 49-year-old, I ended up with an avulsion fracture in the course of moving from evacuation center to evacuation center. Another disabled person, age 57, I felt like I was being chased by radioactivity as I headed out, looking for a place outside the prefecture that would be more than 120 kilometers away. For a person with disabilities like me, finding a barrier-free evacuation center was no small feat. And then third, another very common theme about marriage prospects for your children, age 55. Not a single one of our relatives thinks they'll be able to return to their hometown. My daughter, who just got married and really wanted to have children, has given up on the idea. So this is, again, legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I don't know. There was a movement. There are some people, disabilities activists and their supporters, who have protested against referring to genetic damage from radiation exposure because they said we have a hard enough time in Japanese society with our disabilities, and you are going to rub it into people that there are going to be more disabled children born because of this, and you shouldn't be doing that, on one hand. On the other hand, there is the known damage that could occur. An American historian friend of mine who teaches in Hiroshima, I said, Bo, do you have these, is there that kind of discrimination, like marriage discrimination, in American downwind communities? To which he said, Americans are so clueless about radiation, there isn't any discrimination either. Which is not reassuring, right? But others, another downwinder friend from Hanford, disputes that. She told me when I asked her view, she says, well, I've been criticized for having children. People, perfect strangers, have felt free to tell me, this is an American, I should never have had children. So this is a very, how to deal with this serious risk and yet not compound the suffering of those who are already suffering so much. What are the kinds of, here, I must show you. The person, this is Ruiko Muto. She became famous overnight when she participated. She was on the stage with famous people like Oe Kenzaburo, and September 19th, huge Sayonara Genpatsu. And she was so moving. It's possible that she is the wisest human being I've ever met. She's the head of the Complainants Association, and the vice head is also a woman. You know, this is very special in Japan because so many social movements it's women who make them run, who make them, endure. But the heads are almost always men. But in this case, no. And also because motherhood is a very big issue, I should say that both Muto Ruiko and her vice head are not mothers. They do not have children, but they've certainly thrown themselves very wholeheartedly into the movement to try to protect children. The criminal complaint. So the first criminal complaint was accepted by the prosecutor's office. The remarkable thing about Muto Ruiko is that she never mistakes her enemies. She knows people. For example, they filed their complaint in the Fukushima prosecutor's office. Why? Because the Fukushima prosecutors are living in the same place as they, and they are exposed to high rates, high dosages in the air. And they have children too, some of them. And therefore, it's an appeal to them as fellow human beings, as bearers of the same frail, vulnerable bodies. And guess what? The Justice Ministry, I guess it was, just before the Tokyo Olympics were announced, summarily transferred it to Tokyo. What does it mean first of all, you get that, you lose the local connection. And secondly, for activists, people who have faced this disaster, it ain't cheap to keep going to Tokyo, for gatherings, to appeal to at the court, so forth and so on. It was a brilliant move, and it was turned down. Then, once again, then there's this very interesting system called the, Citizens Prosecutorial Committee. It's something 4 times a year, randomly chosen citizens, sounds a bit like the jury system, but it's not quite. 11 citizens are chosen when complaints have been turned down by the prosecutor to see if there is a case to be made, if anyone should be indicted. And lo and behold, these Tokyo citizens, 8 of them, because you have to have, at least 8 of the 11 have to vote in favor of indictment, said yes, there are 3 top people in TEPCO who should be examined for, severe negligence leading to injury or death. And then it goes back to the prosecutor's office. And guess what? The prosecutors found once again, without, as far as people can tell, investigating much, that no, they didn't merit indictment. So again, no action. Goes again, this was the last chance to a citizens' inquest committee. And this time again, 8 out of 11 said, yes, these 3 deserve. And so now the justice system in Japan, the legal system recognizes that the prosecutors have no will to prosecute, to investigate or prosecute. And so now there are 5 court-appointed attorneys who will be serving as prosecutors in a criminal case. So one of the things that it's important to make clear is that there are many other lawsuits going on for compensation, for, would you believe it, the constitutionally guaranteed right of children to be educated in a safe place. That lawsuit was turned down summarily in the district court, went to the Sendai High Court. The Sendai High Court said, you're right, they're not being educated in a safe place, but even if they went to school in a safe place, they're going home to places with high levels of radiation, so there's no point in acting on this. It's a remarkable decision for an appellate court, isn't it? That adults, grown-up justices, could be unembarrassed and produce a verdict like that. Many, and then there's an alternative dispute resolution in which there's a third party mediating to decide on compensation. TEPCO is so tight-fisted. They posted profits, I think, year before last already. They're so tight-fisted that these alternative dispute resolution cases are not coming to fruition either. I just wanted to read you Ruiko-san's words. You can see here the first word, to accuse others of a crime, has meant that we have had to examine our own way of life. This is from the statement of the complainants for the criminal prosecution of the Fukushima nuclear disaster. This, we feel, is profoundly meaningful, : it is an occasion for questioning the society we have in this country, in which every person is not valued, which imposes sacrifices on some but not others. It is an opportunity for those of us who have been divided and torn apart by the disaster to come together once again and expand our circle. It is an opportunity for those of us who are wounded and in despair because of the disaster to recover our strength and dignity. This, we think, is the way to fulfill our responsibility toward children and young people. It is up to each of us to change the world as we stand with those who cannot raise their voices with other living creatures. So that is, yes, keep tuned to that. The criminal case, what are the obstacles? Well, they're external ones. I mean, it can be summarized by the government saying over and over and over and over, it's safe, it's safe, it's safe, it's safe for you to go back. By changing the standards, by even, and I don't know if many of you know that the World Health Organization, which allegedly is charged with the health of human beings on the planet, had to sign an agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency, that is the agency for promoting the use of nuclear power, 1959, in which WHO is not permitted to make any pronouncements about the health effects of radiation without first getting cleared by IAEA. You can imagine how ineffectual WHO has been, therefore. But even another UN organization, the International Commission on Radiological Protection, who says that the general public should be exposed to no more than 1 millisievert per year. And really tacitly, the way the Japanese government is dealing, 20 millisieverts, okay. Some people even say 100. So just raising the standards. I have even read documents that the United States Environmental Protection Agency, under the rubric of lessons learned from Fukushima, is say, we now realize our standards are too high for cleanup after a radiological disaster. So, keep tuned again to what the agencies charged with protecting our health and really the health of the planet are dealing with this. So this is happening. So because it's safe, 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 it stands to reason that there's no causal relationship between the extraordinary rates of pediatric thyroid cancer, which are being found. Of course, that is the one health effect that has been recognized from Chernobyl, but there are many, many others that are known, many others. And I want to read, there are many heroes that have emerged from Fukushima. I want to quickly read. Tim Mousseau is an evolutionary biologist at the University of South Carolina, and he has spent, it's his 30th year this year, so close to 30 years studying, if you will, the barn swallow in Chernobyl. So he has a very long record with this species of being. And he has said about this difficulty of evidence, cause and effect. Because remember, cancers don't say, I come from a radionuclide that was released in this atmospheric test, right? It's that kind of relationship is impossible to establish. And therefore, say the authorities, there is no causal relationship. But he says, this is the part I want you to remember, that scientists haven't been able to do the follow-up they need to. And in the middle of that paragraph, he says, unfortunately, there is no funding in this area. Scientists, like plumbers, must be paid for their efforts. My conclusion is that the governments and regulatory bodies associated with nuclear accidents do not want to know the answers to the fundamental questions related to the impact of radiation on wildlife and, by extension, human beings. And when he was speaking at the Tokyo Foreign Correspondents Club, one questioner said, some people say you're not really a scientist, but an anti-nuclear activist. To which he said, no, I'm an activist, but not an anti-nuclear scientist. I'm an activist on behalf of evidence-based science, right? Keep your eyes open for Timothy Mousseau. He's a great person. Another kind of pressure that comes externally is a lot of sympathy, like, oh, poor people of Fukushima who have left. You know, they still haven't been able to go home. Well, it so happens that there are many people who have wanted to have left and want to stay away. And this discourse of sympathy does not help them at all. It can be cynical and self-serving. It can be sincere, but it is superficial. There is, another important thing, stress. Radiophobia, the stress from worrying about radiation is worse than whatever impact it can have on the body. I think, I couldn't find this quote this time, but I think I've heard him say or write, Tim Musso, barn swallows do not suffer from radiophobia, right? This is why animal and plant studies are so important, is also their short life cycles, so you can study several generations quickly and come to some conclusions about what implications there might be for human beings. Got to race along now. Internal pressures, this, helplessness and powerlessness. If you are helpless to do anything about your situation, you don't want to know anymore. You don't want information. Supposing you're a single mother and you feel you have no option to leave Fukushima. You do not want to know, and you don't appreciate your neighbor complaining or investigating about the school lunch, whether it's safe or not. There's a concerted campaign to use locally grown, local consumption, very good principle. Whether it's such a great principle here is something else. And I also want to say that I don't think everything grown in Fukushima is contaminated. In fact, there are things grown elsewhere because, don't forget, the government made a point of spreading radioactive rubble around the country. Why do you think they had to do that? It is the most unwise thing to do with radioactively contaminated substances, to transport them far and wide and then to incinerate them. The cynicism behind that takes my breath away. But anyway, so that's the division that Muto Rico talks about a lot, and that she will not ever resent people, fellow citizens who don't want to hear anymore or can't leave and don't leave. So these are the kinds of enormous burdens that are being faced right now. And I'd like to show you very quickly a clip. Well, before that, where's that? We have in our audience someone from Fukushima, and you had on your seats a flyer of a very important film, which I am called Nuclear Nation. It is made by one of the 3 attorneys for the criminal complaint, too, but one of the most experienced trial lawyers in the nuclear issue, who decided he had to become a filmmaker. So that, you know, it's really important that, I think reading back, he was saying that you take this case to court. Now, just because somebody was smart enough to get into the legal institute, training institute in Japan, doesn't mean they're going to understand the ABCs of radiation. So in order to do these series of legal endeavors, we've got to make sure the judges know what the case is all about. So this movie, I understand there's going to be a screening on March 9th, you lucky people. I think that will be the premiere in the US. If you miss it, come to Chicago March 12th. I'm hoping to show it then. I haven't seen it either. And why don't you stand up for a second? She's carrying some DVDs with her, and with your name, she has 8 short versions, 14 minutes, and 2, how many, 5 of the long, 4 of the long? 4枚だっけ全体、2時間いくらのは Yeah, 2 hours when you have about 4 of those. Anyway, she's willing to loan them, particularly to instructors, and if you get in touch with them. So anyway, here's a genuine person from Fukushima here. We're very lucky to have her. Yes. Who told me that she and her husband have just secured the ability to move to Tokyo, which is, you know, it's a very painful and wonderful thing. So, yes. So good luck. Oh, you're most welcome. And I want to show you a clip, a trailer of a film that in Chicago, we will show with this film. And...
電量を測るんだ。放射能が出て体に入ったんだ。母レンジャー。母レンジャーって何？みんなで力を合わせ前に進んでください。こんな仲間がいなかったら福島にいようって思わなかった。とにかく気をつけて気をつけて。もうここに暮らすと決めたトレーニングだよ。当時有名な教授はここで生活して大丈夫、何も心配しないようにと発言し、その発言は社会全体に拡散され、人々は安心しました。ところが言われていることが現実と違ったのです。
これの影響どうかというのは今後きちんと検証する必要があると思っておりますが、これまでの知見から言うと考えにくい。
これ同じことが起きてると思います。はい。未来に残さなかったら何でもできる。確か。
Okay. Let's leave that there. This film, I hope you all have a chance to see it sometime too. It's very, Kamanaka Hitomi has done a nuclear trilogy. She's the first person I've seen, it was so great in teaching class, who connects Hiroshima and Nagasaki with the Persian Gulf War, depleted uranium, goes there and interviews patients and doctors dealing with pediatric leukemia after the Persian Gulf War, and then takes us to Hanford, Washington, to study the downwinders and their health impact. So that whole arc of the nuclear age, the nuclear weapons age, which continues on and on. And then she has also done two other comparisons between Sweden, alternative energy, and a farming fishing community in southwestern Japan that had resisted the siting of a plant for 30 years. And another place in Aomori Rokkasho, that is an achingly beautiful film, that cites a reprocessing plant, something that the United States doesn't do, a lot thanks to Jimmy Carter. Reprocessing plutonium is not a good idea in all of these risky things. This one, she takes you back and forth between Fukushima and Belarus. And you see the kids in this bucolic, they might have as well have been Heidi and Peter in the last scene. They've gone on what's called recuperation or rehabilitation. It's a practice that became quite extensive in Europe, the United States, and Japan. The woman who was interviewed towards the end asked, do you think the same thing is happening, is someone who with her colleagues took in children from Chernobyl for 11 years and gave them, an extraordinary strict diet of uncontaminated food, easier before the Fukushima disaster, and tried to get their young bodies to expel the cesium and whatever else they had ingested from from Chernobyl. And that there are attempts to do rest and recuperation in Japan too. And it became controversial rather quickly because what? What do you need to recuperate from? Because that suggests that there's something to worry about in Fukushima. So Japanese activists, even 2 years ago or so, said, well, we want to make it easier for these kids and their parents. So I said, well, what do you do? Oh, we call them winter study tours because study will justify anything, right? Or, various things. This director is doing something called the movable English language class, or find ways in which kids and their mothers, sometimes the kids alone, can spend some days. Now, days are really not enough. I think in Ukraine, when it was more prosperous, with every Ukrainian under 18 was allowed to spend 2 months in a safe period at state expense, and the length got cut down more and more. So there are these issues that are taken up in this film. What's interesting is this film is having a hard time, especially of all places in Fukushima. People in Fukushima, many say, are not so reluctant to express their opposition to nuclear power. They're not so eager to bring up exposure and being anti-exposure. So in Japanese, datsuhibaku, get out of being exposed, versus datsugenpaku, get out of nuclear, denuclearize. What is it? It's partly, since the government demarcated the evacuation zones so narrowly in this truly stupefying way, because radiation doesn't travel evenly, concentric circles, radii, this and that. This is what is putting the clamp on people who have evacuated. And I heard someone in Sapporo, November, who said, we evacuee parents are now faced with this choice, whether to expose our children to poverty or to exposure, to subject them to poverty or exposure. So those are the kinds of choices. And so what is it? It's part of this whole dynamic of people who don't have a choice, not wanting these distressing things to be part of their soundscape. It's also, I talked about this a bit with Kamanaka-san, the director, and she said, well, maybe also people in the denuclearization movement say that since it's so hard to demonstrate cause and effect, better just leave the health effects aside and let's focus on getting rid of nuclear in Japan. So it's a very weird thing, because obviously you need to focus on both nuclear power and health. And I can't help thinking that the thing about radiation exposure and cancer, the C word, right? Although that is by no means the only ill effect of exposure, is that it does force you to come to terms with, to confront your mortality. And most painful of all, your child's mortality, and the possibility that this creature that you're putting your lifeblood into may not outlive you. How could that possibly be bearable to confront? So I want to end up now, the sense of R. There is that, the first sense of physical danger, the dispersal of the plume and radionuclides all over the northern hemisphere. And I think that is really important. Again, it's our creaturely commonality to be afraid. But then there is another level, which is also the social, political, and historical structure, which has also happened in the United States everywhere, that where communities have become dependent on the nuclear business, there's great reluctance to acknowledge illness and other effects. And we have to think about that, and that really takes me back to Martin Luther King Jr.'s emphasis on economic justice, the importance of economic justice. Tohoku is poor, right? That's also why it has Tohoku and Fukui Prefecture and so many nuclear power plants, because you can persuade the people living there that this is going to change everything, right? And how can you blame them? How can you blame them? But I think this very difficult thing of seeing what's going on across the Pacific is actually, first of all, not simply across the Pacific, and seeing how our own mortality and the life of the Earth, right, as Al Gore said, our only home, are implicated. I think that is what we are called to do now, is at least to try to face up to that and think what we might do from there. And I think if we can find people to do it with, like this great community you have here tonight, that in itself is hope. I mean, hope is not this false thing. I ask you also to remember how much care Kamanaka Hitomi put into making this a non-scary movie, right? Look at that pink. Kind of, I want to say, oh, too much pink. But even so, it is a frightening topic. And so all kinds of care need to go into it. I'm sorry I forgot to say a little bit more about those miserable looking bags that the drone captured. Those are plastic garbage bags, right? If you pay 5,000 yen, I don't know, $45 instead of 25, they're supposed to be good for 5 years instead of 2 or 3. That's where the clippings and whatever from so-called decontamination, which is again like atoms for peace, complete misnomer. It's just a transfer of radioactive materials from here to there. That's what those bags contain, and many of them are splitting. We're just coming up to 5 years, and they're left where kids go to school, like a house that's been decontaminated says, I don't want the bags with our contamination near our house. Move them to the roadside where kids go. And as you know, Yucca Mountain, for instance, it's very hard to find places to store radioactive waste. And now in that area in Fukushima, there are temporary storage sites. Kari-kari okiba is the term that's used. So this is what I leave you with. I'm delighted to answer any questions, get comments, and I'm so grateful above all to have you here to help me think about this. Thank you.